When Claire, a desperate single mother, pleads with Shaq to save her dying baby, he thinks he's stepping in to help with medical bills. But what starts as a simple act of kindness unravels into a chilling web of betrayal, danger, and impossible choices. As secrets about her ex-husband emerge, Shaq realizes he's not just fighting for a child's life, he's battling forces that could destroy them all. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The rain fell steadily, tapping against the windows of Roscoe's Diner, a cozy yet weathered spot tucked into the heart of Willow Creek. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of fresh coffee and greasy burgers. Shaquille Big Shaq Brooks sat in his usual corner booth, his broad shoulders barely fitting between the worn red vinyl seats. Dressed in a simple navy jacket and jeans, he looked every bit the gentle giant, an imposing figure with kind, thoughtful eyes. Shaq glanced out the window, watching the rain blur the glow of streetlights. It had been a long day mentoring at the community center, and the quiet hum of the diner was a welcome reprieve. He sipped his coffee, savoring the moment of peace, when the door swung open with a jingle of the bell. A woman stepped in, soaked to the bone. Her blonde hair clung to her face, and her pale hands clutched a bundle tightly to her chest. She looked around, her eyes wide and searching, before they locked onto Shaq. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice trembling. She approached his booth, her steps hesitant but urgent. "Are you... Shaq? Big Shaq?" Shaq set his coffee down, his brow furrowing as he looked up at her. "That's me. What's going on?" The woman sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation, placing the bundle on the table. It wasn't until she peeled back the edge of the damp blanket that Shaq realized she was holding a baby. "I'm Claire Johnson," she said quickly, her words tumbling over one another. "This is Ethan. He's my son and he's really sick." Her voice cracked and tears welled in her eyes. "Please, I didn't know where else to go. You're the only one who can help me." Shaq's gaze shifted to the baby. Ethan was impossibly small, his cheeks hollow and his skin a pale shade that made Shaq's chest tighten. The baby stirred weakly, letting out a faint, feeble cry that was more heartbreaking than any scream. Shaq leaned forward, his voice soft. "What's wrong with him?" Claire swallowed hard, clutching Ethan closer. He has a rare heart condition. The doctor said he needs surgery, but it's expensive. I've tried everything, charities, loans, even. I'm living in a shelter now. I can't even afford the medication he needs to keep him stable until then." Shaq's brows knit together, his mind racing. He had heard plenty of stories in his time. Families struggling to make ends meet, children caught in the cracks of a broken system. But seeing it up close, in the eyes of a mother barely holding herself together, made it hit differently. Claire's hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled envelope. She slid it across the table. "I don't even know why I'm doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "I saw you on the news once, helping that family after the fire. Everyone says you care about people. I thought, maybe you could at least point me to someone who can help." Shaq opened the envelope and scanned the contents: medical bills, test results, and a letter from a specialist outlining the surgery Ethan needed. The numbers made his stomach drop. "How much time do you have?" he asked, his voice steady but low. "They said a month," Claire replied, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But every day he gets weaker. I'm afraid I'll..." She choked on the words, unable to finish. Shaq leaned back, running a hand over his face. He was no stranger to stepping in when people needed help, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the clock ticking mercilessly. "I'm just a guy," he said finally, his voice heavy. "I'm not a doctor, and I sure as hell don't have the kind of money these people are asking for." Claire's face crumpled, and she clutched Ethan tighter. "Please," she whispered. "I'll work. I'll do anything. Just don't let my baby die." The raw desperation in her voice hit Shaq like a punch to the gut. He looked at Ethan again, the tiny, fragile life hanging by a thread, and then at Claire, a mother who was running out of options but refusing to give up. He let out a long breath, his jaw tightening. "All right," he said quietly. "Let me think. We'll figure something out." Claire blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. You mean it? Shaq nodded, his large hands folding the papers back into the envelope. I don't know how yet, but I'll help you. We'll get Ethan the surgery he needs. For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed Claire's face. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Thank you so much. As the rain continued to fall outside, Shaq looked back down at Ethan, who had drifted into a restless sleep. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about money or surgery. This was about giving a mother hope and saving a baby who hadn't even had a chance to live. And no matter how hard it got, Shaq knew he couldn't walk away. A hush settled over the dimly lit diner as the last of the evening crowd filtered out. Claire stirred her coffee absently, the spoon clinking against the chipped porcelain mug. Across from her, Shaq leaned back in the booth, his arms crossed, studying her with quiet intensity. I appreciate you meeting me here, Claire began, her voice trembling slightly. She tucked a strand of loose hair behind her ear, a futile effort to mask her nervous energy. It's been hard to talk about everything that's happened. Shaq nodded, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. Take your time. I'm here to listen. Claire hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window, as if she expected someone to be watching. You know, people look at me and see someone holding it together. They don't see what's underneath, the cracks. She paused, pressing her lips into a thin line. I've been working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just to keep a roof over our heads. But it wasn't enough. We lost the apartment last month. Shaq frowned. Lost it? How come? Her laugh was brittle, a thin sound that held no mirth. Because I made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, Ryan. She trailed off, her shoulders slumping as if the name itself weighed her down. He left us with nothing but debts and lies. I didn't even realize how deep we were in until it was too late. Shaq leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Ryan Carter, your ex-husband, right? Claire nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug. He walked out 2 years ago, said he needed to find himself, whatever that means. Left me to pick up the pieces, and the bills. Her voice hardened, tinged with bitterness. And when the collectors started calling, I realized he'd been borrowing money. A lot of money. From people you don't say no to. The air between them grew heavy, the hum of the diner's neon sign amplifying the tension. You think he was involved in something illegal? Shaq asked carefully. Claire's eyes darted to him, then away. I don't know. But I do know that the people he owes aren't the type to forgive and forget. I've seen things, Shaq. Cars parked outside the shelter at night. Men who look like they're waiting for someone. Watching. Shaq's jaw tightened. And you didn't think to call the cops? Her laugh was sharper this time, almost a bark. The cops? What am I supposed to tell them? That I have a hunch my deadbeat ex got mixed up with dangerous people? They'd laugh me out of the station. Shaq frowned. You're saying these guys are after you now? Claire hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it's just paranoia. But I can't take that chance. Not with Ellie to think about. The mention of her daughter brought a flicker of vulnerability to Claire's face. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it struck Shaq like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for her child. Where is Ellie now? Shaq asked. She's at the shelter, asleep. At least, I hope she is. Claire's voice cracked, and she lowered her head, staring into the dark swirl of her coffee. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, Shaq. I'm scared all the time. Scared I'll slip up. Scared I'll lose her. The vulnerability in her voice tugged at something deep within Shaq. He wasn't sure what it was. Pity, anger, or a stubborn need to help. But it burned hot and insistent. I'll help you, he said firmly. Claire's head snapped up, her eyes wide. You don't even know what you're getting into. Maybe not, he admitted, but I know you need someone in your corner. And if this Ryan guy's problems are spilling over into your life, we need to deal with it. A flicker of hope crossed her face, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. Shaq, there's more. Something I haven't told you. Shaq tilted his head, his instincts sharpening. What is it? Claire opened her mouth to answer, but faltered. Her hands trembled as she gripped the mug, and for a moment, she looked like she might bolt from the booth entirely. "It's nothing," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forget it." Shaq didn't buy it for a second. "Claire, whatever it is, you need to tell me. I can't help you if you keep holding back." Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw the depth of her fear. It wasn't just about Ryan or the debts or the men watching the shelter. It was something deeper, something darker. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice hollow. Shaq didn't press further, not yet. But as he watched her gather her coat and leave, he made a silent vow. Whatever Claire was hiding, he was going to find out. Shaq adjusted the sleeping baby in his arms as he stood in the sterile waiting room of the private clinic. The muffled hum of medical equipment and distant voices seeped through the walls, but his focus was on Ethan's tiny face, peaceful despite the chaos swirling around them. Claire sat a few feet away, clutching her hands tightly in her lap, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. "Relax," Shaq said softly. "We're in good hands here." Claire nodded, but the anxiety etched on her face didn't ease. "I can't help it. What if they say it's worse than we thought? What if we can't?" Her voice broke, and Shaq shot her a reassuring look. "We'll handle whatever comes," he promised. The door to the examination room opened, and a tall man in a crisp white coat stepped out. His name tag read, Dr. Patel. His expression was calm, but there was a weight behind his eyes that made Shaq's stomach knot. "Ms. Claire Bennett?" Claire jumped to her feet. "Yes, that's me. Is Ethan okay?" Dr. Patel gestured toward a chair, encouraging them to sit. Shaq placed Ethan gently in Claire's arms and took the seat beside her. "We've run a series of tests," Dr. Patel began, his tone measured. "And the results are concerning. Ethan has a rare congenital heart defect, tetralogy of Fallot. It's why he's been struggling to breathe, and why he's not gaining weight like he should." Claire's face went pale. "What does that mean?" "It means he'll need surgery," Dr. Patel explained, his voice softening. "It's a complex procedure, but it's his best chance. Without it," he hesitated, his gaze dropping momentarily. "Without it, his condition will worsen, and his life expectancy will be significantly shortened." Claire's breath hitched, and she held Ethan closer, her tears falling silently onto his blanket. Shaq swallowed hard, his mind racing. "How much are we talking about?" he asked, his voice rough. Dr. Patel's answer was like a punch to the gut. The figure he quoted wasn't just high, it was astronomical. "Isn't there some kind of assistance program?" Claire asked, desperation lacing her words. "There are options for financial aid, but they cover only a fraction of the cost," Dr. Patel said apologetically. "I'm sorry. I know this is overwhelming." Overwhelming didn't begin to cover it. As the doctor left, Shaq placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "I'll start making calls." The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and pleading with anyone who would listen. Shaq threw himself into action, tapping into his network of friends, former teammates, and local businesses. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, and a crowdfunding page was set up. The community rallied behind them, donating what they could and spreading the word. A local diner hosted a fundraiser, and even the neighborhood kids chipped in their allowance money. But as the donations trickled in, it became painfully clear that the gap was enormous. The generosity of the community wasn't enough to bridge the staggering cost of the surgery. One evening, as Shaq was finalizing plans for another fundraiser, a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Long time no see, Shaq." He turned to find Ryan Carter leaning against the wall, his smirk as infuriating as ever. "What are you doing here?" Shaq asked, his tone icy. Ryan straightened and approached with an air of false sincerity. "I heard about Ethan. Tough break for the little guy." Shaq didn't take the bait. "Cut to the chase, Ryan. What do you want?" "I'm here to help," Ryan said, spreading his hands. "I've got connections, people who can make this whole thing go away. All you have to do is let me handle it." Shaq took a step closer, towering over Ryan. "Handle it? Like you handled your marriage? Like you handled your debts?" Ryan's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. You don't know the half of it, Shaq. You think Claire told you everything? She's no saint. And neither are you, Mr. Knight in shining armor. Shaq's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not working. And if you think Claire's going to let you worm your way back into her life, you're delusional. Ryan chuckled, his tone darkening. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? But the people I owe, they don't forget. And if you're not careful, their problems will become your problems. Shaq stared him down, his voice low and steady. Stay away from Claire and Ethan. That's your only warning. Ryan shrugged, his smirk returning as he walked away. Suit yourself, hero, but don't say I didn't try. That night, Shaq couldn't shake the unease that Ryan's reappearance had stirred. Something about the man's confidence didn't sit right. He spent hours digging into Ryan's background, using every contact and resource at his disposal. It didn't take long to uncover a trail of whispers, unpaid debts, shady business deals, and rumors of involvement with a dangerous loan shark known only as Victor. The deeper Shaq dug, the clearer the picture became. Ryan wasn't just a deadbeat. He was a liability, a ticking time bomb that threatened to drag Claire and Ethan down with him. As dawn broke, Shaq sat back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him. But his resolve was stronger than ever. Ryan Carter might have caused the mess, but Shaq would make sure it didn't destroy the people who mattered. For Ethan, for Claire, for the community that had given him a second chance, he wouldn't stop until he found a way. Shaq sat in his car, staring at the crumpled pile of papers on the passenger seat. Each page was a fragment of Ryan Carter's double life: bank statements, loan records, and police reports, all pointing to the same chilling conclusion. Ryan wasn't just tangled up with loan sharks, he was actively working for them. Worse, Claire had been dragged into his web in ways she probably didn't fully understand. Shaq clenched the steering wheel, the weight of the discovery sinking in. He'd spent days piecing this together, calling in favors and chasing leads. Now that he had the truth, it felt like a grenade with the pin pulled, ready to explode at any moment. When he arrived at the shelter, the usual buzz of activity felt muted. Claire was sitting in the corner of the common area, holding Ethan close as he slept. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. Shaq approached cautiously, lowering his voice to avoid startling her. "We need to talk," he said. Claire looked up, her expression wary. "What is it?" Shaq hesitated, glancing around. "Not here. Let's step outside." The cold night air bit at their skin as they stood in the dimly lit alley behind the shelter. Shaq leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression grim. "I found out what Ryan's been up to," he began. "He's deeper into this loan shark operation than I thought. He's not just a client. He's working for them." Claire's breath caught, her hand tightening on Ethan's blanket. "What are you saying? That he's... what? Collecting for them?" Shaq nodded. "And using people as leverage to pay off his own debts. Claire, he didn't just leave you, he sold you out." Her face crumpled, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of collapsing under the weight of his words. "No," she whispered. "That can't be true." "It is," Shaq said gently. "I've got the proof. He used you, used your name and your situation, to buy himself more time with these people. That's why the enforcers are harassing you." Tears streaked down Claire's cheeks as she shook her head in denial. I thought I was doing what I had to do." Shaq frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Claire's voice cracked as she began to unravel the truth. "When Ethan started getting sick, I didn't know where else to turn. I begged the hospital to help us, but they wouldn't even let us stay overnight without proof of payment. I was desperate, Shaq." She wiped at her eyes, her movements frantic. "That's when one of Ryan's old friends showed up. He said he could help, said he'd loan me the money for Ethan's tests. I didn't know what else to do, so I took it. I thought I could pay it back before it got out of hand." Shaq's stomach churned. "Claire, how much did you borrow?" 10,000, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But with interest, it just kept growing. "They started showing up at the apartment at my job. When I couldn't pay, they said they'd take Ethan. They said they'd take him, Shaq." Her knees buckled, and Shaq caught her, guiding her to sit on the cold ground. She sobbed into her hands, the months of fear and guilt pouring out of her. "I didn't know Ryan was behind it," she said between gasps. "I swear I didn't know." Shaq crouched beside her, his jaw tight with anger, not at her, but at the man who had manipulated and betrayed her so thoroughly. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "Ryan's the one who put you in this position, but now we've got to deal with it." Claire looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "What do we do? They're not going to stop. I've seen what they're capable of. They'll hurt us. They'll hurt Ethan." Shaq's mind raced, the urgency of the situation igniting a fierce determination. "First, we get you somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find you." Claire shook her head. "They'll find me. They always find me." "Not if I make it clear that they'll have to go through me first," Shaq said, his voice cold and resolute. "And trust me, Claire, they don't want that fight." For a moment, the weight of his conviction seemed to steady her. She took a deep breath, nodding weakly. "What about Ryan?" she asked. Shaq's jaw clenched. "I'll handle him. He owes these people more than he can ever repay, and he's been using you to buy himself time. That ends now." Claire hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "You're not going to?" "No," Shaq said quickly, his voice softening. "But I am going to make sure he knows he can't hurt you anymore. And I'll get the loan sharks off your back." "How?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He didn't know the full plan yet, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let Claire and Ethan face this danger alone. "Just trust me," he said finally. "We'll get through this. Together." As they returned to the shelter, Shaq felt the full weight of the stakes pressing down on him. Claire and Ethan weren't just victims of circumstance, they were targets. And the people coming after them didn't play by any rules. But Shaq had faced tough odds before. This time, though, the fight wasn't just for himself. It was for a mother who'd been pushed to her breaking point, and a baby who deserved a chance at life. And Shaq wasn't about to let them down. The air inside Victor Hayes' office was suffocating. The dim lighting cast shadows across the cracked leather furniture, and the faint smell of stale cigars lingered in the corners. Victor sat behind a heavy oak desk, his fingers steepled as he studied Shaq with the amused detachment of a predator sizing up his prey. "You've got guts coming here," Victor said, his voice smooth and cold. He leaned back, the faint glint of a gold ring catching the light as he gestured lazily toward Shaq. "But guts won't pay off the debt." Shaq towered over the desk, his broad shoulders squared and his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to fight, Victor. I'm here to talk." Victor smirked, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Then talk. I'm a reasonable man." Shaq didn't sit. Instead, he leaned forward, his palms flat on the desk, closing the distance between them. "Claire and Ethan don't have what you're asking for. You know it, and I know it. But you don't need to go after them to get what you're owed." Victor raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Oh? And what's your brilliant solution, big man?" "I'm asking for time," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "No more threats, no more men showing up at her door. Give me 2 weeks, and I'll find a way to get the money." Victor chuckled, a low, menacing sound. 2 weeks? You think this is a charity?" He leaned forward, his tone hardening. "That woman borrowed from me. She knew the terms. You don't just walk into my world and ask for favors." Shaq straightened, his imposing frame seeming to fill the room. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm giving you an opportunity. You back off Claire and her kid, and I'll make sure you get paid. Push her any harder, and you'll get nothing." Victor's expression darkened, but he didn't look away. For a moment, the room was thick with tension, the kind that could snap into violence at any second. Then slowly, Victor leaned back and laughed. "You've got a hell of a way with words, Shaq. Fine. 2 weeks. But if I don't have my money by then, we're done talking. And believe me, you don't want to see what happens after that." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he nodded. 2 weeks. Without another word, he turned and left, his every step deliberate and measured. Outside, Shaq took a deep breath, the cold night air biting at his skin. His hands were still clenched into fists, the adrenaline from the encounter coursing through his veins. But there was no time to dwell on the close call. He had a plan to execute. Back in the neighborhood, Shaq wasted no time rallying the community. He visited every shopkeeper, every family, and every person who had shown even a shred of kindness to Claire and Ethan. At first, the responses were cautious. People were wary of getting involved in something so dangerous. But Shaq's determination was infectious, and one by one, they stepped forward. "We'll keep an eye on them," said Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly owner of the corner store. "Victor's men won't get past us." "I can pitch in," said Malik, a local mechanic. "Even if it's just keeping watch or running errands, I'll do it." The neighborhood came alive with quiet acts of defiance. People took turns standing watch near the shelter. Parents walked Claire to and from her shifts. Even the kids pitched in, creating a network of lookouts to alert Shaq if any unfamiliar faces showed up. But Shaq knew it wasn't enough. The clock was ticking, and the money Victor demanded still loomed over them like a storm cloud. Late one night, Shaq sat in his small apartment, a notebook filled with calculations and fundraising ideas spread out on the table. He'd contacted every possible resource: his old teammates, local organizations, even strangers who'd heard about Ethan's plight. The donations were coming in, but it was clear they wouldn't meet the full amount in time. As the weight of the situation pressed down on him, a knock at the door pulled Shaq from his thoughts. He opened it to find Claire standing there, Ethan cradled in her arms. "I heard what you've been doing," she said softly. "The way you've rallied everyone. I don't know how to thank you." Shaq shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. This isn't about me. It's about keeping you and Ethan safe." Tears welled in her eyes. "You've done so much already, and I don't deserve any of it." "Stop," Shaq said firmly. "You're stronger than you think, Claire, but you don't have to fight this alone. We'll get through it together." She nodded, her gratitude shining through the exhaustion etched into her face. "Whatever happens, Shaq, I won't forget this. Neither will Ethan." As she left, Shaq's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for Claire and Ethan anymore. He was fighting for the people who had come together to protect them. And he wasn't about to let them down. Shaq stood in the driveway, staring at the familiar silhouette of his old truck. The paint was faded, the edges rusted from years of work. But it had been his lifeline, a means to an honest living when life had offered little else. He ran a hand over the hood, his jaw tight with emotion. "Last ride, old friend," he murmured before climbing into the driver's seat. The engine growled to life, its rumble a comforting sound he'd come to rely on. But today, the comfort was tinged with sorrow. He glanced at the folded flyer in the passenger seat. A local buyer had offered a generous sum for the truck. It wasn't nearly enough to cover Claire's debt in full, but it would buy her safety. He didn't think twice. By the time Shaq returned to the shelter on foot, dusk was settling over the neighborhood. He carried an envelope in his hand, its contents the hard-won price of his sacrifice. Inside, Claire was waiting, pacing anxiously with Ethan in her arms. "Shaq," she called out when she saw him. "What happened? Where's your truck?" Shaq handed her the envelope without a word. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowing as she opened it. The sight of the money inside made her gasp. "Shaq, what did you do?" "I sold the truck," he said simply. "It was the only way to get the cash fast enough." Claire's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears. "You can't. Shaq, that truck was your livelihood. How are you going to—" "I'll figure it out," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "This isn't about me, Claire. This is about you and Ethan. You're not fighting this alone anymore." The dam broke, and Claire collapsed into a chair, her sobs muffled against Ethan's tiny shoulder. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." "You deserve to breathe without looking over your shoulder," Shaq said. "You deserve a fresh start. And Ethan deserves a chance to grow up safe." Word of Shaq's sacrifice spread quickly through the community. By the next morning, the neighbors were buzzing with the story. "He sold his truck?" Malik, the mechanic, exclaimed as he passed the corner store. "For her," Mrs. Alvarez said with a shake of her head. "That man's got a heart bigger than this whole neighborhood." The sentiment turned into action. Inspired by Shaq's selflessness, the community began rallying once again. The diner held another fundraiser, this time with matching donations from a local business owner who'd heard about Shaq's gesture. Parents pooled resources to collect baby supplies and food for Claire and Ethan. Kids went door to door collecting loose change, their jars filling faster than anyone expected. Even Malik stepped up, offering Shaq a temporary job at the garage. "I don't care if you don't know a wrench from a tire iron," he joked. "We'll make it work." Meanwhile, Victor Hayes was watching. When Shaq returned to Victor's office with the cash, the loan shark eyed the envelope with mild curiosity before tucking it away. "Well," Victor said, his tone clipped. "That's a good start." Shaq's fists clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "It's what I could get for now. I'll work on the rest." Victor leaned back, studying him with an inscrutable expression. "Most people come in here with excuses, promises they can't keep. But you sold your truck for someone else's debt." He chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "That kind of loyalty is rare." "I'm not here for your approval," Shaq said flatly. Victor's smile faded. "Fair enough. But let me offer you something anyway." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I'll cut the debt in half if you do one thing for me." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "What's the catch?" "Ryan Carter," Victor said, his name dripping with contempt. "That little weasel thought he could play both sides, skimming off the top while throwing others under the bus. He made a fool of me." Victor's gaze hardened. "Bring him to justice. Get him off my radar for good, and I'll make sure Claire and her kid are clear." Shaq folded his arms, his mind racing. He didn't trust Victor, but the offer was tempting. Taking Ryan down would solve more than one problem. "And what happens to Ryan if I do this?" Shaq asked cautiously. Victor shrugged. "Not my concern. Let the law deal with him. All I care about is making an example." As Shaq left the office, his thoughts churned. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time, a path forward seemed possible. His sacrifice had set something in motion, something bigger than himself. The community was rallying, Victor was willing to negotiate, and Ryan's betrayal was catching up to him. Now it was up to Shaq to finish what he'd started. The police cruiser's lights cast flashing red and blue reflections against the dingy brick walls of the alley. Ryan Carter, disheveled and defeated, was escorted out in handcuffs. His protests fell on deaf ears as the officers loaded him into the car. Victor Hayes watched from a distance, his expression a mix of satisfaction and annoyance. "I keep my word," he muttered to Shaq before disappearing into the night. For the first time in months, the weight on Shaq's shoulders felt lighter. Weeks later, the waiting room outside the pediatric recovery ward was hushed, save for the occasional muffled voices of nurses. Claire sat clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes fixed on the double doors. Shaq was beside her, a steadying presence as they waited for news. When the surgeon finally emerged, his warm smile said everything. "Ethan's surgery was a success. He's a strong little guy." Claire broke into tears, and Shaq felt a surge of relief. The fight had been long and grueling, but for the first time, hope didn't feel so fragile. In a modest apartment filled with the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight, Claire cradled a smiling Ethan in her arms. His cheeks were fuller, his giggles a melody that made every struggle worth it. Across the room, a few volunteers from the shelter were unpacking donations. Claire, now a fixture in the shelter's outreach efforts, was directing them with a confidence Shaq hadn't seen before. When Shaq entered, Ethan squealed with delight, reaching for him with tiny, eager hands. "Well, look who's feeling better," Shaq said, scooping the baby up and earning a round of giggles. Claire smiled, her gratitude evident. "He's got a whole new lease on life. And so do I, thanks to you." Shaq waved her off. "It wasn't just me. Everyone came together for this." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Claire opened it to reveal Malik and a group of neighbors, their faces alight with excitement. "Surprise," Malik said, stepping aside to reveal a gleaming truck parked at the curb. Shaq blinked, stunned. "You didn't have to." "We know," Malik interrupted. "But you'd have done the same for any of us." Later that evening, as Shaq prepared to leave, he paused at the door looking back at Claire and Ethan. "When we stand together," he said, his voice steady with emotion, "even the hardest battles can be won." The door closed behind him, and the apartment filled with warmth, laughter, and the promise of brighter days ahead. This story is a powerful reminder of how compassion and unity can change lives. If you believe in the strength of community and the power of standing up for what's right, don't let this message stop here. Like, share, and comment to spread the inspiration. And let's remind everyone that even the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest impact.